In November 1956, an event took place that quietly reshaped the entire global order. The most powerful empire the world had ever known, one that once controlled nearly a quarter of the planet, collapsed in less than 2 weeks. This empire had dominated global trade for over 100 years through its currency alone. And yet, in just 11 days, it was forced to surrender. Not because of a lost war, not because of a revolution, but because of a single phone call. On the other end of that call was the United States government. The message to Britain was blunt and unforgiving. End your military operation in Egypt immediately, or we will destroy your currency. The United States threatened to sell every British pound it held. It warned it would block Britain's emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, and it made clear it would stand by while Britain's economy collapsed. Britain had no real options. Within hours, the largest empire in history backed down. It did not surrender to soldiers or tanks, but to debt, financial weakness, and the painful realization that it was no longer the power it believed itself to be. That moment, known as the Suez Crisis, marked the true end of British global dominance. But here is what schools rarely explain. History books often leave this out. Britain did not fall because of one crisis in 1956. That moment was only the final act. Britain collapsed because, for decades before that phone call, it made the same choices and repeated the same mistakes that the United States is making today. And by 2026, those mistakes may finally catch up with America. To understand how Britain fell, you first need to understand how it rose. During the 19th century, Britain was the unquestioned center of the global economy. The British pound was not just another currency, it was the currency. Nations used it for trade. Central banks stored it as reserves. International contracts were written in pounds. This gave Britain enormous power. It could print money to fund wars. It could borrow at extremely low interest rates because everyone trusted its currency. It could run trade deficits year after year because the world needed pounds more than Britain needed balanced finances. If that sounds familiar, it should. But beneath the surface, trouble was growing. By the late 1800s, a new economic force was emerging across the Atlantic. The United States had overtaken Britain as the world's largest economy. American factories produced more. American innovation moved faster. American wealth expanded at a much quicker pace. Yet the pound remained dominant. Why? Because of inertia. The world was used to the pound. Financial systems were built around it. Changing currencies was inconvenient and disruptive. So even as Britain's economic strength weakened, its currency stayed powerful for a while longer. Then World War I changed everything. Britain borrowed enormous amounts to fund the war. When the fighting ended in 1918, Britain had gone from the world's biggest creditor to one of its largest debtors. It owed massive sums, especially to the United States. Instead of adjusting to this new reality, Britain made a disastrous decision. It chose denial. In 1925, Britain committed what many historians consider one of the worst economic mistakes of the 20th century. It returned to the gold standard at the same exchange rate it had before the war. In other words, Britain insisted the pound was just as valuable as it once was, even though the country itself clearly was not. That moment was driven by pride and ego, and it came at a severe cost. To keep the pound artificially strong, Britain raised interest rates to painful levels. Economic growth slowed to a crawl. Unemployment surged. British goods became too expensive for foreign buyers. At the same time, leaders continued spending as if the empire were still at its peak. Military bases stayed open around the world. Imperial commitments continued. Debt kept piling up.
The cracks became impossible to ignore in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, investors began attacking the pound. The numbers no longer worked. Britain was spending more than it earned and borrowing more than it could repay. Reputation alone was no longer enough to hold the system together. In 1931, Britain was forced off the gold standard entirely. Almost overnight, the pound lost nearly 30% of its value. And yet, even after this humiliation, the pound remained a major reserve currency. Why? Because Britain used its empire to prop it up. Colonies were required to hold reserves in pounds. India, Australia, Pakistan, and many other territories had no choice but to keep using British currency. Britain was effectively using its colonies to support a failing financial system. The United States is doing something very similar today. The petrodollar system, where oil is priced in dollars, forces countries to hold American currency. The difference is that colonies eventually gain independence, and oil-producing nations eventually grow tired of American foreign policy. Then came World War II. Once again, Britain borrowed heavily. This time, its debt exceeded £14 billion, a staggering amount at the time. By 1945, Britain owed more money than its entire economy produced in a year. The empire was functionally bankrupt, surviving only because of American loans and goodwill. Still, Britain refused to accept reality. Military forces stayed deployed worldwide. Leaders continued acting like a superpower. Prestige spending continued, even though the money was gone. That denial set the stage for 1956. When Egypt's president nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain viewed it as an attack on its authority and oil access. Alongside France and Israel, Britain launched a military invasion to retake the canal. Militarily, the operation was working. British forces advanced quickly, Egyptian resistance weakened. But Britain had forgotten something critical. It was no longer the world's banker. America was. President Eisenhower viewed the invasion as outdated colonialism that would push developing nations toward the Soviet Union. He decided to act. The United States threatened to dump its holdings of British pounds on the open market, which would have collapsed the currency. It also blocked Britain's emergency IMF loan. Britain's foreign reserves were draining at over 100 million per week. Financial collapse was days away. Prime Minister Anthony Eden ordered an immediate ceasefire and full withdrawal from Egypt. In return, the United States allowed Britain to access IMF funds. The Suez Crisis lasted only 11 days. But it exposed a truth that had existed for decades. Britain was no longer a superpower. It was a debtor nation living on borrowed money and borrowed time. Now here is why this story should deeply concern every American. The United States today is following the same path that destroyed Britain. Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio after World War II exceeded 200%. America's debt-to-GDP ratio is approaching 120% and rising fast. Over $2 trillion was added to the national debt in just 1 year. The government borrows roughly $7 billion every single day. Britain lost reserve currency status in part because it maintained a global military presence it could no longer afford. America spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined. It operates over 750 bases in more than 80 countries. We are policing the world with borrowed money. Britain forced colonies to use the pound. America forces oil to be sold in dollars. But that system is weakening. China and Russia conduct most trade in their own currencies.
BRICS nations are building alternatives. Even longtime allies are hedging. Britain refused to accept its decline. America still behaves as if it is 1995, as if the dollar has no rival, as if military power can solve everything. That mindset destroyed Britain, and it threatens America now. Britain's fall was slow, then sudden. The warning signs were visible for decades: rising debt, shrinking industry, military overreach. Then one crisis ended it all in 11 days. America's Suez moment is coming. It could be a failed war, a debt-ceiling disaster, a sanctions failure, or something unexpected. The numbers for 2026 are especially alarming. Interest payments are projected to exceed $1 trillion annually, more than defense or Medicare. When Britain reached this stage, collapse came fast. One day it issued demands, the next day it followed orders. The British Empire's final mistake was believing reputation could replace reality. America believes the same today. But history does not care about beliefs. It only cares about math. The pound collapsed not because of enemies, but because of choices. Overspending, excessive borrowing, pride over solvency, living in the past instead of preparing for the future. America is making those same choices right now. The clock is ticking. I am not saying this to scare you. I am saying it because history offers lessons, if we are willing to learn. Britain ignored every warning until it was too late. We still have a chance, but the window is closing. Before Suez, British economists warned leaders to cut military spending and accept reality. They were ignored. The public rejected decline. Critics were labeled traitors. America is in that same moment now. The warnings are everywhere. The Congressional Budget Office has sounded alarms for years. Economists agree the path is unsustainable. Former Treasury secretaries and Federal Reserve chairs are warning openly, and yet nothing changes. Let me be clear. When a reserve currency falls, ordinary people suffer. Savings lose value. Imports become expensive. Inflation rises. Jobs disappear. Living standards collapse within a generation. If the dollar loses its status, every American will feel it. Prices will surge. Interest rates will spike. Taxes will rise or services will vanish. This is not speculation. This is history. Britain's decline took about 30 years. Its collapse took less than 2 weeks. America's foundation has been weakening for 50 years. That means the shock, when it comes, could be even faster. The question is not whether America will face its Suez moment. The question is whether we will be ready. Will we build resilience, savings, and real production, or will we watch decades of denial catch up with us in days? That answer may define the future. I will see you in the next one. Subscribe.